Hi everyone, this is the second video for week 7 of the human rights class. I'm going to discuss the issue of cultural relativism, particularly as it appears in the Fernando Tizon article, though I'll also briefly mention Xiaorong Li's article about Asian values, so-called Asian values. So first of all, let's discuss cultural relativism. Cultural relativism is the view that people have different moral truths, different moral responsibilities, or different rights depending on what cultural group they live in. And that's the view that Tizon is challenging in his article because it undermines human rights. He's sort of taking up this issue, particularly as it relates to challenges to the whole concept of human rights. I don't want to focus too much on what he calls meta-ethical relativism. I think the term that he describes there is what I would call moral anti-realism, but I don't worry about that too much. What he calls normative cultural relativism is really more what I'm going to focus on. And the main issue with this view is the role this view plays in shaping discussions around human rights or as an objection to human rights. First, the objections to relativism that he presents. The first is this notion of sort of the self-contradiction of cultural relativism, because cultural relativism proclaims that there are no universal moral rules, and yet, in a sense, it offers a kind of universal moral rule that one's morality has to come from one's culture. So that's a somewhat appealing kind of attack on this position, because it catches it in a self-contradiction. I think there's some philosophical value to that, because it hits on this point that, if it's really relativism, relativism of any kind really ends up being self-refuting, because it proclaims to be a principle of what's morally true. Though one could just say that, well, there really is no moral truth anyway. So that's the kind of more meta-ethical point of view of it. So it's not the strongest argument against cultural relativism. The second part of it is more interesting. The second objection he discusses is more interesting. It's the universalizability of moral norms. Now, this point of view might be correct. In other words, that moral norms always have a kind of universalizable kind of form to them. That is, we expect, to put it in less technical language, we expect that moral norms apply to everybody. That when we talk about moral norms, we talk about them as if they apply to everybody. That's usually the case, but I would say that there are ways of thinking about moral norms as being very situational, and he mentions that possibility actually as a counter objection that cultural relativists might offer. One of the things that I would say here is perhaps a stronger objection to cultural relativism of this kind might be to say, especially because human rights relates to law, a stronger objection might be to say that when moral values are enshrined into law, we expect them to be universalizable. That is, we expect law to apply to everybody in the same way we expect law to apply across the board. So insofar as human rights is dealing with areas of law, it makes sense to think about cultural relativism as being false as a way of dealing with issues around law. Though I'll say more about that at the end of this video. The third objection that he presents is Kantian in nature. He talks about the dignity of a person, the Kantian ideal of autonomy. I don't think that one has to accept a full Kantian picture to get at what he's driving at. I think one could say that one of the problems with cultural relativism is that it sort of eliminates the role of the individual in deciding moral norms. That is, if we have any notion that individuals have some role in shaping and deciding their moral norms, then somehow cultural relativism doesn't capture that. I think a better way to put this objection is that every culture has diversity within it. So if I say that people have to take their moral norms from their culture, but any culture that one could be in has disagreement about moral norms within it. So it ends up being impossible to peg down what it is that cultural relativism would actually be talking about. Right? You kind of have to only think of the kind of romantic notion of an isolated culture um, that is, very traditional and probably very authoritarian in a certain way, that enforces very strict and very specific kinds of rules on its society. Such societies exist, but even still, societies and cultures develop and change, and that change comes about by way of argumentation and discussion and transformation of its own moral rules, of the society's own moral rules. So the idea that somehow there is a stable entity called the culture and its rules and its morality isn't actually the case, and so that basically it renders cultural relativism incomprehensible, really, as a kind of position about what morality is. That to me is the strongest argument against cultural relativism, which is valuable, I think, because I think it avoids this kind of romanticizing view of other cultures as very static, but it also has real philosophical weight to it as an argument. And also, I think it values the individual without necessarily assuming a kind of modern Western or liberal conception of the individual as radically free. That is, it's not radical individualism necessarily, but it just posits that there's disagreement within a culture, that a culture is complicated, is I guess the best way to put it. And I think that's a good way to think about cultures, to recognize that different societies and cultures are complicated. They're not monolithic. And I think that provides both kind of historical realism and philosophical weight to a good argument against cultural relativism. Tasson also discusses the problems with cultural relativism as a way of thinking about human rights, because it seems to support what he calls the elitism argument and the conspiracy theory argument about human rights. The elitism argument to me is particularly interesting, and I think connects with Xiaorong Li's article about Asian values. She really exposes the notion of Asian values as really just a kind of corrupt idea promoted by dictators who want to defend themselves against, who basically want to ignore human rights and come up with a seemingly moral justification for that. I think that this is a good example of where cultural relativism seems to support the notion of human rights as just an elitist project. Now, I will say, just as some final observations, I do think sometimes human rights, I think I mentioned this in the last video too, human rights does come across as elitist, and we have to be very careful about creating that impression. I say we, but people who, especially who are human rights advocates and teachers and officials, have to sort of avoid the impression that human rights is an elite project. I think it's a genuine problem, not so much with the concept of human rights, but with its implementation. I would add to that there's a lot of laws in societies that are very local, that are not meant to be universal at all, and it's taken for granted that if you're in one country, you're going to follow the laws of that country. If you're in another country, you're going to follow the laws of that country. It may be that we think that human rights are different, but at the same time that we could acknowledge that human rights law could be interpreted in different ways, or could take shape and be implemented in different ways in different countries, with some sense of local ideas about human values and the human condition. It's not necessary for us to agree on what the human rights are all right away. human rights can be an open discussion going on within societies and across societies. So I think that's just a sort of an observation that just because we think of human rights as universal doesn't mean that human rights has to look the same way everywhere. And that's not a logical contradiction necessarily. And as I said in the last video, people can disagree about what the human rights are, and that those disagreements may be rooted in cultural differences about understandings about humanity and human values. But that doesn't mean that human rights isn't universal, and that's not saying that is not an endorsement of cultural relativism.